Hey you guys, what's up? In today's video, I'm going to be showing you my entire eyeshadow palette collection. I have every single eyeshadow palette that I own laid out right here for you guys. So really quickly, before we get started, I would really appreciate it if you would give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you're not already. Also, make sure you have your notifications turned on. That way you get a notification every time I upload a new video. Just click the bell next to the subscribe button, and yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So today's video is probably going to be a really long one. If you want to watch it faster, all you have to do is change the playback speed. You can increase the speed from like 1.5 times speed to 2 times speed. I always watch my videos in a faster speed just to get through them quicker. It really helps me if you guys watch my entire video like all the way through instead of skipping through the video. So yeah, let's go ahead and start with all of the palettes I have. I don't even know where to begin. I might start somewhere over on the side and work my way up and then down. So I'm gonna start with all of my Huda Beauty palettes. I love her palettes so much. This one is probably my favorite Huda Beauty one. This is the Desert Dusk palette. I just love the colors in this palette. These foiled shades are super nice. The entire like color scheme of this palette is just something that I really love. Then we have the first Huda Beauty palette I ever bought, and this is the Rose Gold Edition palette. She did like remake that palette, which I never bought the like remade version, but this is just a really pretty like pink palette. I haven't used this in so long. I do really like this palette, but I would say that her newer palettes are better. Then we have my last Huda Beauty palette. This is the new Nude palette. I love this palette so much. This is a really nice like pinky mauve palette, perfect for every day. These shades like this, these foiled ones, are so pretty, and I love that this palette came with like an eye base primer. So yeah, I also love this palette. These shadows have really good pigmentation and they blend out really nicely, and then of course these shimmery shades are so pretty. So next up, I'm going to be going through all of my ColourPop palettes, and I have a ton. So the first one is the You Had Me at Hello, and I feel like this was my first ever ColourPop palette. I love this palette. This is also a really nice palette for every day. This shade right here is so pretty all over the lid. I have hit pan on it. The mattes in the ColourPop palettes are really nice. These are affordable palettes, but the shadows are seriously so good. Then we have the ColourPop Whatever palette, and I believe this was part of their like fall collection, and this is a super gorgeous like kind of like burgundy warm toned palette. I really love the pressed glitters in the ColourPop palettes. They just add like a really nice touch to any look. Love this palette, perfect for the fall. I have quite a few tutorials using this palette. Then we have their Flutter By palette, which was part of their like butterfly collection, and I'm pretty sure I only ever used this palette one time, but it's not because I don't like the palette. I just never find myself reaching for this one, but I really like the shadows in this palette. Like this glitter right here is so pretty. I love the color scheme in this palette. I really just need to start using this more. This is a really nice palette for every day. Next up, we have the Give It To Me Straight palette, which is also another palette that I just don't really find myself reaching for very often. And it's not because it's like not a good palette or anything. I just don't ever really use this palette, but the mattes in here are really pretty. This has some really nice shades for in the crease. This is also a really good palette for every day. Then we have the California Love palette, which I believe was part of their like summer collection. And this is also a really pretty warm toned palette. I'm pretty sure I've only used this like one time. It's not my favorite. I would rather use the Whatever palette over here just because I like those shadows like a little bit better, but this is a really nice pretty palette. You can create some really nice looks with it. Next we have the Going Coconuts palette, which you guys know is one of my favorite ColourPop palettes. Mine is like super dirty. I just showed this in my March favorites video because I love it. These shadows are like the perfect tones for every day. You have some like warm tone mattes, then you have this really pretty neutral brown that is perfect for the crease, and we have these really pretty foiled shades right here. I highly recommend this palette if you're looking for a really nice everyday palette. Then we have their Smoke Show palette. I don't know why there's like tape on my palette, but this is a gorgeous smoky eye palette. This isn't like the normal kind of like shadow palette I would gravitate towards, but these shadows in here are so good. I really love all the matte like grays, and then the black is really good as well. And then this like shimmery silver shade right here is so pretty. I'm like obsessed with that shade. I love putting that all over the lid. Next up is the Baby Got Peach palette, and this is just another palette that I haven't used very often. I've probably used it maybe like 1 or 2 times. It is a super pretty palette, and this glitter right here is like everything. I love that shade. I just don't find myself really reaching for this palette very often, but it is a really pretty palette. Then we have the Making Mauves palette, which is a newer palette from ColourPop, and as you guys can tell, this is a really pretty mauve palette. I actually really like this palette a lot. This is definitely a really good palette for every day just because you have your more like neutral, cool toned shades. Next, I'm going to be showing their like larger palettes like this. This is the It's All Good palette, and I love this palette, you guys. This is such a pretty like pink and purple palette. It's like the perfect like kind of like sunsetty palette. I love this palette so much. The glitter shades in here are so pretty. Then we have their So Jaded palette, which was like a collaboration with Kathleen Lights, and I also love this palette. I really love all their large palettes like this. I just created a look with this palette and I'm just obsessed. I love all the blues and the greens because I don't normally wear like blue or greens, but I feel like this is the perfect palette if you guys want to like try out shades like that. Once again, the glittery shades are super nice. I love those, and then these shimmery shades in here are really good as well. And then my last ColourPop palette is this one right here called Bare Necessities. Now I would recommend this palette to like everyone. This is a really nice palette for kind of like everyday natural looks. You have warm tone shades, cool tone shades. I feel like you can just create so many different looks with this palette, so I highly recommend this one. Next we have all of my Anastasia palettes. This one was my first ever Anastasia palette, and this is the Modern Renaissance palette. This is a gorgeous like warm toned eyeshadow palette. I haven't used this in so long, but I remember I searched everywhere for this palette when it first came out because it was like sold out everywhere. Then we have the Norvina palette, and I also really love this palette. You can create so many different looks with this palette, and there is so many pretty shades. Like I love these shades Soul and Love. And then we have really pretty shimmery shades. Celestial is a gorgeous shade, and also I really love the shade Rose Gold. And then my last Anastasia palette is probably my favorite. This is the Soft Glam palette, and this is just like the perfect warm toned palette for every day. There are some like repeat shades that I think are in Modern Renaissance, like Burnt Orange I think is in Modern Renaissance, and maybe one of these brown shades, but these are just like the perfect shades for every day. You have your warm toned shadows, but you also have like the shade Dusty Rose over here, which is really pretty, kind of like a mauvey, cool toned shade. If I were to recommend one Anastasia palette to you guys, it would definitely be the Soft Glam palette. So next up we have, I believe this is my first ever eyeshadow palette, and this is the Lorac Pro palette. This is like the Pro 1 palette, and when this first came out, this was like so iconic because it had the entire row of mattes and the entire row of shimmers. I used to love this palette. The Lorac shadows in this palette are really good. I used to have like the second palette, I believe, but I did end up getting rid of that one, so I only have like the first one left. Then I have their Mega Pro 3 palette, which I believe was like a limited edition palette for the holidays, and this is a really pretty kind of like neutral everyday type of palette. I used to have the Mega Pro 2 palette, which was also limited edition, but I did get rid of that one as well just because I never used it. Also from Lorac, I have their Neon Lights palette. Oh my gosh, my cat is literally walking over there. This is a pressed pigment palette, and it has so many pretty colorful shades. I really like this palette a lot. The matte shades are super nice. I've created some really pretty colorful looks with this palette. Next up, I believe this is my only Sigma palette. I used to have another one of their palettes, but I think I gave it to my sister. This is their Viper palette, and this was a part of their holiday collection a while back, but this is a really pretty palette. I love this green shade right here, and then this shimmery shade is so nice. Next, I have this palette here from Gadi, and they did send this to me a while ago. This is definitely not my favorite palette. It does have some pretty shades, but they are a little bit powdery. I think this is the only eyeshadow palette I have from this brand, and I think I've only probably used it maybe like once or twice. Next, I have this palette here from Stila, and this was like such an iconic palette back in the day. This is their Eyes Are the Window Soul palette, and I bought this because of like all the YouTubers at the time talked about it. It is a really good palette for every day, but after trying out so many eyeshadow palettes in the past few years, this is definitely not my favorite. The formula is not the best, but this shade right here, which is called Kitten, is so good. This is like the best shade in the palette. It is a good palette, just not something I really reach for very often. Next, I have this palette here from Wonder Beauty. This is their Seascape eyeshadow palette, and I'm pretty sure I got this in a BoxyCharm or something. It did come broken. It's not my favorite palette. The shimmery shades are really good, but the matte shades are not the best. This is another palette that I'm pretty sure I got in a Boxy Luxe, I want to say. This is from the brand Storybook Cosmetics. This is their Fairy Tales eyeshadow palette, and this is a really pretty palette. I actually like this one a lot. The matte shades are really good, and then these shimmery shades are so pretty. Next, we have all of my Urban Decay palettes. This is the Born to Run palette. I feel like this is a really underrated palette. I love the color scheme of this palette. It has so many pretty colorful shades. The mattes are good as always. Urban Decay has really nice eyeshadows, and then these shimmery shades are really pretty as well. I have gotten quite a bit of use out of this palette. I haven't used it in a while, so I need to like get back into this palette. Next, we have the Naked Honey palette, which I haven't used that much. I think I've only used it maybe like one time. It is a really pretty palette. It's just not like the normal kind of color scheme that I would go for. The shadows though do perform really well. I did do a tutorial with this palette palette on Instagram, and the mattes were really nice and pigmented and they blended out easily. And then the shimmery shades, this one in particular is really pretty as well. And my last Urban Decay palette is the Naked Heat palette. I'm pretty sure I've gotten rid of like the rest of my Urban Decay palettes. I used to have the Naked 2 palette, so I really like the Naked Heat palette. The colors are definitely the kind of shadows that I would gravitate towards. They are really warm and pretty. I really like this palette a lot. I definitely recommended this one. Okay, just kidding. I have one more palette here from Urban Decay. This is the Game of Thrones palette, and this palette is really amazing, you guys. It has this really cool pop-up right here of the Iron Throne right here. I have an entire video on this collection. If you guys want to see that, I will just probably link it below. But these shadows in this palette are so gorgeous. I love this palette so much. But the mattes that are in here, like this one right here, House Lannister, they're really good. They have nice pigmentation. Love this palette. I really like these purple shimmery shades down here as well. So next I have two palettes from Violet Voss. This is their Holy Grail palette, which I did buy. I believe this palette did also come in a BoxyCharm, but I gave that one away. This is a really pretty warm tone palette, perfect for every day. I do like this palette a lot. I just don't really find myself reaching for it very often. Then I have their Essentials palette, which either came in an Ipsy or a BoxyCharm. I cannot remember. This is also a really nice palette, but I don't think I've really used it very often. I've only used a couple of the shades. They are really good. I just never really find myself using Violet Voss palettes very often. Next up, I have some Makeup Geek palettes, and these are super old. These are kind of like collector's items to me. This is the Manny MUA palette, which, oh my gosh, this was like a huge deal when it came out. Super gorgeous palette. I really just haven't used it in a really long time, but it is a really nice palette. Then I have the Z palette here, which is such a disaster. Almost every single one of these shades in here is a Makeup Geek single shadow from like way back in the day. This one right here, I believe, is a MAC shadow, and then maybe like this brown one is MAC. Next up, I have some dupe palettes. The first one right here is from the brand Bad Habit, which like doesn't even exist anymore. This is their Athena palette, and this is a dupe for the Huda Beauty Desert Dusk palette. I did a video on this palette, and it actually is a really good palette. Then we have this palette right here, which is from Alter Ego, which is like a newer dupe brand. This is their Sahara palette, and this palette is gorgeous. I'm pretty sure this is a dupe for a Natasha Denona palette. I really like this palette a lot. The quality is great. I definitely think that Alter Ego is better than Bad Habit was. Then I have two Makeup Forever palettes, and I'm pretty sure you can't even get these anymore. This one was a limited edition palette from so long ago. I used to love this palette. Clearly, this has gotten a lot of love. It is a really pretty shimmery palette. And then we have this palette right here, which I really don't think you can get anymore, but you might be able to get it somewhere for super cheap. It was on sale for quite a while, but this is an all matte palette, and I used to love this palette. I used to use it like literally every day. Then of course I have my Zoeva Taupe palette, which you guys just saw me test out in one of my recent videos. I did get this in a BoxyCharm, and this is a really nice palette. I definitely want to try out some of the other Zoeva palettes now. And I do have three palettes here from Dominique Cosmetics. I have this palette right here, which I believe is like her sweater palette. I'm not sure of the name. I don't see a name anywhere on it, but I think this came, oh my gosh, I'm dropping all of these. I think this came in like an Ipsy maybe, and I haven't used it yet. I have swatched it, and these shades are really pretty. Then we have the Celestial Thunder palette, which I want to say came in a BoxyCharm, and this palette is so stunning. This shimmery shade right here is so gorgeous. I haven't used this one either, but I have swatched it, and I have heard really good things about it. And then I have my Latte palette, which is my first ever Dominique Cosmetics palette that I bought, and I love this palette. These shades in here are so gorgeous, perfect for every day. The shade Macchiato right here is so pretty. I love this shade all over the lid. And then the matte shades have great pigmentation. They're super buttery and soft, and yeah, I really love this palette a lot. Next up, we have all of my Morphe palettes. This is obviously the James Charles palette. This is such a good colorful palette. I highly recommend it. If you guys are looking for a really good colorful palette, this one is amazing. They do have a smaller size of this if this one is just way too big for you guys. Then we have my favorite Morphe palette, which obviously has been used and abused. This is the Morphe and Jaclyn Hill palette. Ugh, I love this palette so much. I use this literally every single day. I cannot recommend it enough. This is the perfect palette for every day, but then you also have your pops of color over here if you want to create a little bit more fun of a look. Then I have all these little palettes from Morphe, which honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of. We have this one right here, which is the 15H palette, and I'm pretty sure I got all these on like Octoly. This is a gorgeous palette. You know what? Actually, I might have gotten this in like an Ipsy or a BoxyCharm. This one is really pretty, and I don't even think I've actually used it. It looks brand new. Then we have this one, which is the 15T palette, and I've used this one I think like one time. It is a really pretty palette, but not really colors that I really like. And then the last Morphe palette I have is the the 15S palette. And this one is a really pretty palette, but I just never find myself reaching for it. Next up, I have all of my like iconic Too Faced chocolate bar palettes. Obviously, the first one is the original. I think the only one I don't have is the semi-sweet chocolate bar, but this is the original chocolate bar palette. I love this palette. I think it's such a good palette for every day. Really pretty neutral shades in here. These shimmery shades are really nice, and these palettes smell amazing. Then we have the chocolate bonbons palette, which I'm pretty sure my husband bought me for Valentine's Day one year, and I do like this palette. It's just not one of my favorite chocolate bar palettes. The shadows are pretty good. I like some of the matte shades for the crease, but it's not my favorite chocolate bar. Then we have the chocolate gold palette, which I think was such an underrated palette. This palette is stunning. I love all of the shimmery shades in here. I really like this palette a lot, and like I feel like people didn't like this one. Then I have some more dupe palettes here from Alter Ego. I did get sent some of these, but I also have bought some myself. First we have the Aurora palette right here, which is so pretty. I believe this one is also another dupe for a Natasha Denona palette. It is a stunning palette. I really love the Alter Ego palettes. They're really good. Then we have the Daydream palette, which I did purchase, and this is a dupe for the Huda Beauty New Nude palette. I do have a video where I compare both of the palettes. If you guys want to see that, I'll have it linked in my description box below. But once again, this is a gorgeous palette. Love it. Then we have the Goddess palette, which again, I believe is a dupe for a Natasha Denona palette, which I don't have any of her palettes, but this palette is so stunning. All of the gold shimmery shades in here are so pretty. They might look kind of similar on camera, but in real life, they kind of have different like undertones, or they're a little bit duochrome. Then the last Alter Ego palette I have here is the Temptress palette, which is a dupe for, I believe, the Anastasia Sultry palette. Is that even a palette? I believe that's what it's called. But I really love this palette a lot. It performed really nicely. The mattes are really good and pigmented, and these shimmers are gorgeous. Next up, I have some little drugstore palettes. This first one is from Wet n Wild. This is a dupe for the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette, and this palette is bomb, you guys. And I'm pretty sure it's only like $4 or $5. I do have a really old video where I compared this, I think, to the Modern Renaissance. I can't remember, but I did do a video with this palette. Then I have a few of the CoverGirl full spectrum palettes here. The first one right here is the Reverence palette, which is a really pretty kind of like neutral gold palette for every day. Then we have this one right here, which is called their Zodiac palette, which is full of a bunch of really pretty shimmery, like colorful shades. And then the last one I have is probably my favorite, and this is the Posh palette. This is a really pretty kind of like pink and purple mauve palette. Then I have two palettes from Profusion. They did send me both of these, and these are so good. I feel like Profusion is a super underrated brand. The first one is the Festival palette, which is a gorgeous, colorful palette. I've used this in so many different of my looks on Instagram. Love this palette. Then we have their Mirage palette, which I also love. There's so many pretty shades in here. This is like the perfect kind of sunset palette, and the glitter shades in here are stunning. Next, I have this palette right here. This is the Sephora Pro Editorial palette, and these were like a big deal a couple years ago. This one is a colorful palette, and oh my gosh. Okay, obviously mine's a mess, but I do really like this palette a lot. I like the mattes more than I like the shimmery shades. It is pretty expensive, so I would definitely say there's other like better colorful palettes out there, but it does have some shade like these two right here that I don't really have in other colorful palettes. So yeah, I do keep this one around because I don't have any others like it. Next, we have the BH Cosmetics Take Me Back to Brazil palette, which is also another like really colorful palette, and this isn't my favorite colorful palette. These shadows are good, but they're not great. It is an affordable palette. People rave about this, but I would definitely say if you're looking for a good colorful palette, I would just go with the Morphe and James Charles palette. I find myself reaching for that one more than I do this one. Next up, I have this Ofra Pro palette, and I don't think that I've ever used it. This is an all matte eyeshadow palette, and these shades are stunning. I just haven't picked it up and used it yet, so yeah, but it is a really pretty palette. Also from Ofra, I have this palette right here, and this is a really pretty palette. It's not my favorite. Then I have 3 Deck of Scarlet palettes, and Deck of Scarlet is like a makeup subscription service. I have this one right here, which is their edition number 12. I'm only gonna open like the top section because the bottom section is like lipsticks, but these are the shades in this palette. Then I have this one right here, which is the number 16 palette, and I love this one. This has such gorgeous shades in it. And then the last one I have is the edition number 9 palette, and this is probably my favorite. I love all the shades in this palette. You can use these big shades over here as like blush and highlight, but you can also use them as eyeshadow as well. Next up, I have this palette from Alamar Cosmetics, and I did get this in a BoxyCharm. This is a gorgeous palette. The shimmer shimmery shades right here are so good. I really love this palette a lot. Then I have this palette here from Buxom, which is so old. This is the Dolly's Wild Side palette, and I love this palette. I used to use this palette every single day. It's just a really pretty, like, pinkish mauve palette. Then I do have a few palettes from Pixi. The first one I have right here is, I'm not sure of the actual name of this palette. It says a few things on the back, like double tap, I'm not sure. But the mattes in this palette are not very good, but the shimmery shades are really nice. Then I have both of these palettes right here. This one is the Natural Beauty palette, and I don't know, these Pixi palettes are not my favorite. I feel like the mattes are not very good, but then the shimmery shades are really pretty, but these are on the more affordable side. Next up, I have all of my Tarte palettes, and this one is the Tartelette in Bloom palette. I recommended this palette to like everyone. This is such a good like starter eyeshadow palette. It has the perfect shades for every day. Then my next palette right here, I bought this and then I kind of regretted it. Like, it looked really pretty, but it's not the best. This is the Love, Trust, and Fairy Dust palette. Like, look how pretty it is. The shimmery shade right here is really nice, but then the rest of them were just kind of a little bit lacking for me. So I never find myself reaching for this palette. And then my last Tarte palette is this one. This is one of the like Rainforest of the Sea palettes, and I'm pretty sure it came in a BoxyCharm. This is a good palette, but once again, not my favorite. Then I have two palettes here from Rimmel, and I have never used either of these. They do look really pretty though, so let me know in the comments down below if you guys want to see any kind of looks with these. Then I have this one palette here from the brand Palladio, and I actually really like their products. You can get them at Sally Beauty. This is their Island Vibes palette, and this one is in the shade California Sunset. This is a really good palette. The shades perform so nicely. The mattes are really good, and the shimmer shades, and I'm pretty sure this is a pretty cheap palette. Then I have like two of these little Dose of Colors palettes. I was so excited about these when these first came out. I have the Marvelous Mauves palette, which are super pretty shades. These are all matte, and they do have really nice pigmentation. Sometimes they can be a little bit hard to blend, but overall these are really good shadows. I just never really find myself reaching for these palettes very often. Then we have the Blushing Berries palette, and I believe my husband got me this one for Christmas a few years ago. These shades in here are so pretty. I love these warm toned kind of plum shades, but once again, I just never really find myself reaching for these palettes since I do have to use another palette with them because I always like to have like a shimmery shade in looks. I did forget this one Profusion palette that I have. This is the Chestnut Eyes palette, and I haven't used it yet, but it does look really pretty. I'm gonna swatch some of these. Yeah, Profusion has really nice eyeshadows. I love their eyeshadows, so I'll definitely have to try this out. Also, Profusion has really good brushes. I definitely recommend them. They do sell them individually now. Next, I have my Too Faced Just Peachy Mattes palette, which was like my favorite palette for so long. I've gotten so much use out of this palette. This palette is full of super pretty, warm, obviously peachy shades. I love this palette. I definitely recommend it if you're looking for a really good warm toned matte palette for every day. Then I have this one palette from The Balm. This is the In the Balm of Your Hand palette, and I did get this in an Ipsy Glam Bag Plus. This is a really nice palette. I like their shadows a lot. It has bronzers and blushes in it, and then it has their Mary Luminizer highlighter in here. I really like this palette, but I personally wouldn't like purchase it with my own money. Obviously, I paid for it in my Ipsy, but I wouldn't like go out to buy this myself. So next up, we have a super beat up palette. This is the L'Oreal La Palette Nude Intense, and this is a pretty expensive drugstore palette. I do like this palette, but it's not the best. The mattes don't have that great of pigmentation, and the shimmery shade also is not that great. It's a little bit powdery. All right, you guys, so I saved the best for last. I have all of my Jeffree Star Cosmetics palettes. The first two I'm going to show you guys, they don't sell anymore, and I'm so sad about it. I love this palette. This is the Thirsty palette. This was one of his palettes from like a summer collection, and look how gorgeous these shades are. I'm obsessed with this palette. I always want to use it for looks, but I try not to because I know you guys can't get it anymore, which is super sad, but this palette is so pretty, and it's definitely one of my favorites from him. Then we have the Alien palette right here, and this palette is also really pretty. I'm not normally into like green shades, but I do think this palette is really nice, and obviously his shadows perform so well. The mattes are so pigmented, blend out so easily, and then the shimmer shades are like so metallic. Then we have the Mini Breaker palette, which I love this palette. It's such a pretty palette. Love all the purples in here. You can create so many pretty looks with this palette. Then we have the Blue Blood palette, which is a gorgeous blue palette. You can also create kind of like natural looks with these shades over here. I've only used it one time. I did do like a pictorial with this palette that's on my Instagram. All right, you guys, so this is the last palette in my collection, and hopefully I didn't miss any. This is my favorite Jeffree Star Cosmetics palette. This is the Blood Sugar palette. First of all, his packaging is just so amazing. It feels so luxurious. I cannot say enough good things about this palette. It has so many pretty pinks, reds, purples. Love it. The shimmery shades, like this one is just so good. So yeah, out of all his palettes, this one's definitely my favorite and the one that I would most recommend. So that is my entire eyeshadow palette collection. If you guys want to see any more collection style videos, like, I don't know, maybe concealers, blushes, highlights, anything like that, let me know in the comments down below. I can definitely do those for you guys. So I hope you guys all enjoyed today's video. If you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you're not already. And also make sure you guys have your notifications turned on. Just click the bell next to the subscribe button so you can receive a notification every time I upload a new video. And yeah, I will see you guys in my next video. Thank you so much for watching.